Okay, we're going to be starting very shortly, just waiting for participants to join us. Okay, welcome everyone to Down the Wire. This is CND's US election special. And of course, we're all really strongly aware that it's just 3 days to go to the big day. Of course, the US election always catches global attention, but I think that this year's will be the most avidly watched with the most feared outcome. Trump's presidency has been hugely controversial. It's given rise to massive protests in the US on a huge range of issues. His time in the White House has given confidence to far-right movements and politicians internationally. So this election truly is of global significance. Here in the UK, there have also been massive protests, and CND, I'm proud to say, has been part of them. We've been involved in the big women's marches, and we've been a crucial part of the Together Against Trump coalition. We've helped mobilize hundreds of thousands of people. Of course, as CND, we've had a big focus on the dangers of Trump's attitude towards nuclear weapons. Basically, his plans to use them and building new ones with that purpose in mind, so-called usable nuclear weapons. And his presidency has ushered in a new era of militarism and a collapsing international order. We've seen how he's pulled the US out of so many treaties. So it's not surprising that we're living in a more frightening world, particularly when you add coronavirus and his mishandling of that into the mix. So we're all watching for the election outcome. What will the result mean for the next 4 years? What will the election outcome mean for the US nuclear weapons arsenal, for international agreements and possible conflicts? What kind of difference will each possible outcome make? And what can the world expect? So these are huge questions, and I'm absolutely delighted to say we've got a really fantastic panel of US experts and activists. I think they're all both to share their thoughts and analysis with us today. We're really, really fortunate to have them with us. So thank you for getting up a bit early and joining us today. So each will speak for about 8 minutes. Then we'll move to Q&A. So please, audience, please put your questions in the box there. And if you want to aim it for a particular person, please note that down as well. And also, of course, use the chat. I know that the speakers, if they have a chance, they will respond to points in the chat. If you want to put any links yourself, comments and so on, please do so. So, first of all, over to our first speaker, Phyllis Bennis. Phyllis is a fellow of the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., and also of the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam. She was a co-founder of the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights and the United for Peace and Justice anti-war coalition. And it was that where we worked closely, CND worked closely with United for Peace and Justice in trying to stop the war in Iraq. That was the first time I met Phyllis. She also serves on the board of Jewish Voice for Peace and the Afro-Middle East Center in Johannesburg. Her books include Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict and Understanding ISIS and the New Global War on Terror. She has served as an informal advisor to several top UN officials on Palestine issues and was twice shortlisted to become the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied territories. So, Phyllis, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kate. Glad to be with you all. Thanks to CND for organizing this and the other organizers as well. And before I say another word, I want to extend my greatest solidarity and that of JVP and others to my dear friend Jeremy Corbyn and the others in the Labour Party who are the subject of this weaponization of anti-Semitism that we're seeing in both the United States and the UK in very dangerous ways. So we stand with you. We stand with those who are fighting back against this weaponization of anti-Semitism as an attack on the left more broadly. And we hope that it's dealt with very quickly. You know, you spoke, Kate, of the interest around the world in watching the US elections, and that's certainly been true for a very long time. When we elect a president in this country, we're very aware, electing the head of the empire in many ways. So it's not surprising that there's that kind of global engagement and global interest in what happens in our elections. And while we might see that the US empire is in a relative decline in certain economic ways, et cetera, it is still by far the biggest economy in the world, by far the biggest, by a huge margin, military power in terms of amount of money that's spent, weapons held, weapons power, the shipment of arms all around the world. So it still remains a key domineering and dominant power in the rest of the world. This election shows us once again, but with perhaps greater clarity than before, the reality of US democracy, which in many ways, we speak of it as being such a flawed or broken democracy. The reality is, in my view, US democracy is working very much as it was designed to work. And that is to privilege the wealthiest, the whitest, and in a way that makes inequality far more legally justified in the United States than it ever should in the name of democracy. The parties, the two-party system that we have is not representative of most people in the country. And in many ways, the elections are certainly partly about elections and about the candidates. Both parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, share many characteristics. They are both corporate driven and corporate accountable. They both support wars around the world. They both are dependent on big money sources, but they are also different. And the stakes in this particular election could not be higher. We hear that every year. This election is more important than any other. And it's often true, but I think few people around the world, and certainly no one in the most marginalized and most vulnerable communities in the United States, would see this as not true. This is certainly a moment of enormous tension, and the stakes really could not be higher. We are not looking here at a choice between the right wing and the progressive forces, the good guys and the bad guys, but we are looking at a situation where one side, one party, one of these corporate war-connected parties also is supporting elements in the street that are near fascism. We are, in a sense, what we are choosing here for progressive activists in the United States, we are choosing our opponent. We're not choosing an ally. There is no ally to the progressive movement who is running for president. So the question is, which opponent is going to give us the opportunity to have our voices heard more? Where will our movements have the potential to have more influence and move closer to power? There's a famous thing that was written by Howard Zinn, the great US historian, who talked about the origins of the United States being grounded in genocide and slavery, genocide against the native people, the indigenous people of our land, and the slavery process that brought Black Africans in chains to the United States, what became the United States. But Howard also wrote about another aspect of history, which I think is equally or more important, which is that from the origins of the United States, from those origins in genocide and slavery, there was also the history of movements against genocide and slavery right from the beginning, sometimes victorious, sometimes not, but those movements already always existed. So what we're looking at now, Trump has put together and has consolidated a kind of global axis of authoritarian governments around the world. He has given political support, financial support, military support to these dictators who are building authoritarian regimes from Brazil to the Philippines to Hungary and beyond in a very dangerous way. At home, he links the most extreme elements of xenophobia, Islamophobia, and racism in the United States in a way that makes it far more dangerous to live in our country for the most vulnerable communities. Just looking at the impact of the COVID pandemic, which you all know has had devastating impacts around the world, But the highest numbers, the worst outcomes, have been in the wealthiest country in the world, the United States, where we now have over 230,000 people dead from COVID and over 9 million people who have been diagnosed with this terrible disease. And now the Trump administration has admitted that they are, quote, not getting rid of the virus. Not that they can't, that it's no longer a priority, that they are simply going to manage it, abandoning who knows how many more tens or hundreds of thousands of people's lives. Again, disproportionately lives taken from us from Black and Indigenous and Latinx communities, the most vulnerable communities. The Trump administration has ended crucial regulations that protect the environment, that protect public health, that enable banking interests. Those regulations have been simply swept away. They've added new regulations that have made things far worse in terms of education. Even the post office, as many of you will know, has been under attack, as well as empowering these fascist elements in the street, appointing the most right-wing, ideologically driven judges right up into the Supreme Court, which now has a 6-3 majority of far-right extremists among its justices. And on the international arena, excuse me, we know that there has been, as Kate mentioned, an escalation in interest of escalating all aspects of the US nuclear weapons program, the abandonment of the Iran nuclear deal, which has made the possibility of a nuclear arms race across the Middle East far more likely, particularly in terms of Israel's continued nuclear arsenal growth. We see the moves in support of Israel, again, supporting the most extremist elements within the Israeli state, moving the embassy, recognizing Jerusalem as the capital, recognizing the legitimacy supposedly of settlements, recognizing the occupation of the West Bank and of the Golan Heights as somehow legitimate, recognizing the legitimacy of Israel's new nation state law that legalizes apartheid in Israel. And again, building this regional anti-Iran coalition grounded in the withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal, the new deals with Bahrain and the UAE, possibly with Sudan, maybe others, all designed to build a militarized regional coalition against Iran. Now, Joe Biden, on the other hand, supported the Iraq war, although he now says that it was a big mistake. He's part of the long-standing consensus supporting Israel, supporting Israeli settlements, although he has criticized in words, but certainly not in action, those settlements. The one thing where there's a specific and important difference is on the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, where so much of Biden's credibility is grounded in his having been President Obama's vice president. He gets a great deal of credibility for that. And because Obama's biggest diplomatic victory was that Iran nuclear deal, Biden is a big supporter of that. So that could be one arena where there's a very specific difference between the candidates.
You've had 8 minutes now, Phyllis.
Oh dear. Okay, then I'm going to cut the rest about the candidates and go right to the movements, because I think the issue of movements is far more important. We have been in this amazing period of movement building, from the Women's March, the Black Lives Matter movement that has spread around the world as well as across our country, movements around climate, immigrant rights, healthcare. All of these issues have come out in powerful new movements. And one of the impacts is that they are now having an impact within the Democratic Party, which for the first time in my political career, which goes back way longer than I like to admit, is seeing a real divide in the party, where there is now a progressive wing of the party that has to be taken seriously. So if Joe Biden wins this election, he will have to be aware that it was made possible by the fact that the Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren wings of the party supported his candidacy and urged people to vote for him despite their massive disagreements with his policies. That has made things very, very different. That gap is huge. Now, we do have to understand that the biggest gap between the progressive wing and the centrist wing of the Democratic Party is in the arena of foreign policy and military policy. So our movements, the movements that are focused on demilitarization, on ending the war on terror, on ending the nuclearization of the US arsenal, on ending militarization at home, our movements are going to have the hardest task because it's the one area where there is the biggest gap between those two wings. So I want to end with just a quote that came out in New York Magazine a few days ago that I think captures this, from a writer named Rebecca Traister. And she said, if enough people believe that the problem was Trump and not the interconnected inequities that he embodied and exposed, not the authoritarian right-wing power grab he made so visible and unadorned, and if the effort to defeat him fails, too many will think their exertions were for nothing, rather than understanding them as a crucial early stage in organizing. But there is a twin risk, the risk of winning on election day. Because if Trump is defeated, she says, if the Senate goes to the Democrats, the temptation for far too many will be to curl back up and return to slumber. I think that's a very important message for all of us. This election is not between good and bad. The day after the election, the day after we know the result, we will be in the streets organizing. The kind of organizing, the focus will be different depending on who wins, but there is no question that it will be the role of movements that determines the outcome of how this election is going to affect not only our own people, but this US-led empire all around the world. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Phyllis. That's a great starter for us all. It's really informative and useful for us over here. Okay, so now we'll move to our second speaker. It's a real pleasure to welcome Vincent Intondi. Vincent is a professor of history and director of the Institute for Race, Justice and Civic Engagement at Montgomery College in Tacoma Park, Maryland. From 2009 to 2017, he was Director of Research for American University's Nuclear Studies Institute in Washington, D.C. Vincent regularly works with organizations exploring ways to include more diverse voices in the nuclear disarmament movement. His research focuses on the intersection of race and nuclear weapons, and he is author of African Americans Against the Bomb, Nuclear Weapons, Colonialism, and the Black Freedom Movement. So welcome, Vincent, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you, everybody, for coming on this call, and for I'm honored to even be part of it. As a historian, we often look past or look at the past to determine where we are and where we're going. And to be brief, 4 years ago, for a number of circumstances, including Russian interference, an absolutely dreadful candidate on the Democratic side, a backlash to having our first Black president, a number of reasons, we ended up with arguably the worst human being in our country as president of the United States. And I remember those when I had conversations with progressive organizations, my friends who are on the left, and so on and so forth. And there was this talk that maybe that would have been a good thing, that perhaps it would start some revolution in our country, that people would wake up now that we had this president who was so awful. And that didn't happen. And yes, as Phyllis mentions, we had enormous movement building, but in my opinion, they never went far enough. When you have a president like we have had with President Trump, in my opinion, there should have been millions of people storming the White House. He should have had to flee in exile. When those children were put in concentration camps on the border, we should have gone down there and liberated them, instead of just marching with our pink hats, or just movement building and tweeting or having change.org petitions, right? This is a different time. And I do agree with Phyllis in that, yes, we have a system that is an empire. We have a system that is dominated by corporate interests. We can argue for years that the parties, there isn't really much difference between them. But there has been reform on one side of the party, starting with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal. And we cannot dismiss that. It is not revolutionary. It is not completely changing the system of institutional racism and capitalism that this country was founded on, but it has. And I know this primarily because of my own life. I know this because I teach in the most diverse school in the continental United States, and because so many of my students are Muslim, students who are first generation, are DACA students who have faced police brutality. And I saw them in my office shaking in terror and crying and having anxiety attacks because now with a Muslim ban, they were not allowed in this country. They could not go home on a winter break or a spring break. I see my students now that have COVID and now have pre-existing conditions. And while Obamacare is not perfect healthcare, if that goes away, they will not have healthcare. I watched as Obamacare took care of a vital piece of seniors' medicine so that my father's brain tumor, he was able to afford the medication. And my wife, who is Puerto Rican, I have seen what it has done to her and to her family when Trump abandoned Puerto Rico during that god-awful hurricane. So I have seen with my own eyes what has happened and what is the difference between parties, because while I was not a fan of Hillary Clinton and she had her own issues, the number of times I've woken up in the last 4 years and read the New York Times, the Washington Post and said this wouldn't be happening if Hillary Clinton was president was endless. Granted, there would be a whole nother set of issues, no question about it. And so I do think that there is a difference. And again, that is not to say that Biden is the perfect candidate. There is none. There is no savior that is going to save us over this giant system that needs to be completely dismantled and changed. But when we look at foreign policy in particular, I do believe that Joe Biden will not allow and do what he can to make sure that Russia is not hacking and doing something with our elections so that Putin gets his candidate. I do believe that when Russia puts bounties on our military's head, that Biden will not sit idly by. I do think that Biden will get back into the Paris Agreement. I do think that he will get back in the Iran nuclear deal. I do think that he has talked about being in favor of no first use. If you look at his vice president, Kamala Harris, she voted against the 2018 Defense Budget Act because of nuclear weapons. She has signed letters with other senators and House reps about that no president should have the sole authority to use nuclear weapons. Now, do I think everything will change with him in power if he wins in terms of things Phil's talked about with policies on Israel or endless wars in the Middle East? No. But just like Obama and just like Phil said, I do not put that on him. Just like Obama said, it is not yes, I can, it was yes, we can. And the problem was that progressive groups did not organize and did not push. They thought that was the end instead of the beginning. And so Joe Biden needs to, if he is in power, he needs to be supported when he does something that we agree with and that is good for this country, good for the environment, and then also pressed and pushed when he does not do something. That is on us. And so if Trump wins, if Trump is able to get this election, I think you are going to see a dramatic difference because, and this is why there's so many people in this country who are absolutely terrified. There will be no winning of re-election he has to worry about. You will have, in my opinion, I think he will pull a Putin where he will often try to change the Constitution where he will stay in power forever. He will have no intention of leaving. He has referred to African nations as shithole countries. He has talked about why can't we bomb? Why can't we use nuclear weapons? Why can't we have more nuclear testing? South Korea should have nuclear weapons. Saudi Arabia should have nuclear weapons. Japan should have nuclear weapons, more usable nuclear weapons, spend trillions on nuclear weapons. And it just takes any one thing for him to go to war with North Korea, Iran, whatever the case may be. And so we may see a point now where we are very similar to where we were with Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. Ronald Reagan, in his first term, never had a nuclear agreement that he went with. He destroyed every previous nuclear agreement, and that is what Trump has done. But the difference is in the 1980s, there was a real movement for nuclear disarmament, a real peace movement in this country. That reached its zenith with June 12, 1982, when over 1 million people protested in the streets for nuclear disarmament, the famous Central Park rally. We are going to be on the 40th anniversary of that in 2022. And so when you look at the Reagan era, people were genuinely scared that there was going to be nuclear war between Russia and the United States. They saw where that money was being spent, and it reignited this movement that we are sorely lacking right now. And the reason that we have all of these movements from Black Lives Matter to climate change to the Women's March that Phyllis has mentioned, yes, they are doing wonderful things. In some ways, they don't have a choice because they are so under attack. But the peace movement in this country, the anti-nuclear movement in this country is lagging behind, as Phyllis mentioned. And part of the reason for that is because there is internal racism and because there is patriarchy within those movements that needs to be dealt with, that we're finally starting to see a reckoning with. So, as yes, we say democracy is not in the sense that we would think of democracy and how this country is founded, there are stark differences right now. And if he is reelected, this country will not survive. The word for 2020 in this country has been trauma, from COVID to what Trump has done, especially to people of color, especially to immigrants in this country. And I really, truly feel that we will break, that we will not be able to handle another 4 years of him. And so while Biden will not be perfect, and there are plenty of things to criticize him on, from his past statements and past actions to being a centrist now, I think our country's future is so dependent on this election. And as we often say it, but I really do think this is the election of our life, of our survival right now. So I'm going to stop there so that we have more time for a lively discussion, answer any questions you might have. So again, I want to thank you guys for having me today.
Thanks very much indeed, Vincent. That's really powerfully argued position there. So I'm sure we'll have really good discussion and debate around that. And now our third speaker is Margaret Kimberly. Welcome, Margaret. Great to see you again. Margaret is a founder and editor and senior columnist for Black Agenda Report. She is the author of Prejudential, Black America and the Presidents. She has also contributed to the anthologies In Defense of Julian Assange and Killing Trayvons, an anthology of American violence. Margaret is an administrative committee member of the United National Anti-War Coalition and the coordinating committee of Black Alliance for Peace. And Margaret, we met only recently.
Yes, we did.
Working together against the new Cold War on China, which of course is such a crucial campaign. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Kate. I want to thank you and the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament for inviting me to participate on this panel today. There are people who make the case that people all over the world should be able to vote for the President of the United States. They can't do that, but at the very least, they should know something about who they may be dealing with. And I hope to shed some light on how this may turn out. We don't know if Donald Trump will be reelected or if Joe Biden will succeed in challenging him. Polls indicate that Biden is ahead, but that's no guarantee. It's best to look at the history of both men, and we can see that they have much more in common in regard to foreign policy than they have differences. Trump is the known quantity and incumbent president. We have seen him withdraw from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action between Iran and the nations known as P5+1, the US, UK, Russia, China, France, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, plus Germany. This unilateral withdrawal destroyed a years-long negotiated agreement and exposed Iran to a reimposition of crushing sanctions. Donald Trump ordered the assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani at the moment he arrived in Iraq to begin peace talks. The Iraqis officially voted for the US to finally leave after 17 years of occupation, only to be told that their wishes did not matter. Sanctions are used to punish targeted nations such as Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Zimbabwe. In the case of Venezuela, we know that more than 40,000 people in that country have died as a direct result of sanctions, which make it impossible for that government to conduct financial transactions. These sanctions exist in conjunction with an active effort to choose a new president, instigate a coup plot, and browbeat US vassal states like the UK into supporting their plan. When the US realized it failed to militarily dislodge Syrian President Assad, they enacted even harsher sanctions and stole Syria's oil too. Trump moved the US embassy to Jerusalem and has connived recognition of Israel with Gulf Arab states. Of course, these countries were always cozy with Israel, but now they betray the Palestinians out in the open. But what can we expect from Joe Biden? He has a record, after all, as a senator for many years and then as vice president serving under Barack Obama. We can only assume that he will repeat those policies. It is interesting that his campaign website says very little about it, but here is what we know. Lest anyone think that there is a lesser evil in foreign policy, we must remember what Biden and Barack Obama did over an 8-year period. It was the Obama administration that asserted a right for the president to assassinate anyone, including US citizens, anywhere for any reason. They used jihadist proxies to destroy Libya. They tried to do the same thing to Syria. They created millions of refugees in the process, and no one should see desperate refugees crossing the Mediterranean without assigning blame to the Obama administration. Ukraine is now a failed state with the civil war within its borders, thanks to the US siding with neo-Nazis who overthrew the elected president. Obama began the so-called pivot to Asia, the effort to neutralize China's growing economic prowess with the strongest weapon America has, its military. As for nuclear weapons, Obama did sign the New START Treaty, but also embarked on a so-called modernization of the nuclear arsenal, which came along with a price tag of over $1 trillion over a 30-year period. If you doubt what I'm saying about the lack of difference between the two, I will let their friends in the military-industrial complex make my point for me. The CEO of Boeing, a leading American defense contractor, said that he didn't care who won the election. I don't think we're going to take a position on one being better than the other, he said. The CEO of another defense contractor, Raytheon, said the same thing. When the Trump campaign accused Biden of wanting to cut defense spending, the head of Raytheon came to Biden's defense and said that it was ridiculous that Biden might cut the budget. Biden is on record as saying that the $733 billion defense budget may have to increase. Boeing, Raytheon, and all the rest all know that they have little to fear in any electoral outcome. I'm going to show you a photo, not very good quality, unfortunately, that I took when I was in Washington last year. This picture, let's see if I can do this successfully. Share my screen, and there we go. And it's a rather grainy photo, unfortunately. This from, it's an advertisement in the Washington, DC Metro. This one from Lockheed Martin, defense contractor. And you see these in Washington, it's very interesting. Obviously, I can't buy a fighter jet or anything, but this is for the lobbyists for members of Congress. And there's a subliminal message, I think, that has an impact on the public, telling us that our wishes on these issues don't count for much, that they are the ones who run the show. Hold on, sorry. Here we go. Just a moment. Okay. So this is what we see. Now, it's true Trump walked away from the Open Skies Treaty and the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. He's in the process of sabotaging the New START Treaty, which Biden says he wants to renew. And that's a good thing. But let's talk about what Biden says himself. We don't have to guess. What does he say? In their last presidential debate between Trump and Biden, Biden referred to Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and Kim Jong-un as thugs. Like Trump, he has little use for diplomacy. And I hope that no one in the UK or anywhere else in the world is putting their hopes for peace in either of these men. While the US electoral system depends on campaign contributions from hedge funds full of defense industry cash, the people know they don't have to follow them. I'm a coordinating committee member of the Black Alliance for Peace, and we call on all elected officials in the US to support the United Nations Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Our position on this treaty is just one item in our candidate accountability campaign, wherein we ask signatories to commit to cutting the military budget in half, oppose the militarization of local police departments, end the 1033 Defense Department program, which gives military aid to localities, close all US and NATO foreign military bases, including closing the US Africa Command, AFRICOM, and making the African continent a zone of peace. We should also strive to make peace a campaign issue. Unfortunately, Americans, even many people who call themselves leftists, are willing to treat foreign policy as some sort of a fringe issue that isn't worth standing for. Bernie Sanders is an example of that, progressive in his domestic policies, but supporting nearly all US imperial initiatives. Recently, a proposal in Congress to cut defense spending by a mere 10% failed, with Democrats joining Republicans to defeat the legislation. We have to make clear that when a country spends nearly 60% of its discretionary budget on defense, the people's needs will not be met. This is something easy for the average person to understand, and we must never stop making this case. I want to close by reiterating what I said earlier. There will be few areas of foreign policy difference should we see a Biden presidency. We should forget all talk of Trump being an outlier president who is uniquely dangerous and fascistic because he is more bombastic and less elegant in his words and in his manner. One more quick story. You know, when Trump was diagnosed with COVID a few weeks ago, being Trump, he came back to the White House and made this appearance on the balcony and ripped off his mask. And people immediately made connections between him and Mussolini. But I wrote on Twitter, I said, quote, Trump struts around on a balcony looking like a dope, and he is called a fascist. He kills 40,000 Venezuelans with sanctions, and all you hear are crickets, unquote. The US-NATO axis is fascistic, claiming rights to dictate to every country on the planet and ignoring the sovereignty of any country that gets in their way. This will not change regardless of the electoral outcome unless the people force that change. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Margaret. That's fantastic. That's a lot of food for thought for us, certainly. Right now, Q&A. So we've had quite a few questions coming in. Some have already been answered by our very active speakers there, but I've got a few others that have also been submitted. Well, first of all, we've had a couple in about Latin America. One has been directly answered, but there's another one which is very topical. And I think it's interesting in terms of setbacks for Trump, really. And that's about the recent victory of MAS in Bolivia against the Trump-backed candidate. So Claudia from Lewisham says, with the recent MAS victory in Bolivia, is this a big setback for Trump's policy towards Latin America? So would anyone like to quickly give an answer to that?
I would. Yes, it is a setback, thank goodness. We had the Evo Morales was reelected. The US uses hybrid warfare, propagandizing in the corporate media through the Organization of American States, which is just a US puppet, to helping the military to force Morales to flee the country. But fortunately, the Bolivian people came together, and there was a general strike there a few months ago, and the project fell apart. So this is the kind of thing that we need to see more of. But I want to add that there was no opposition from the Democrats about Trump's foreign policy in Latin America. And that's so I'm expounding a little on the point I was making earlier, that we cannot count on a huge difference taking place should Biden win.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, so I'm going to go to some more questions. So I'm going to read out a couple and then ask each of you if you'd like to respond to any aspect of that. So I've got one from Jean in Cardiff. She says, will Trump try to steal the election? That's quite an interesting one, because we've heard quite a bit about, will he just get his paramilitaries out and refuse to leave the White House? So that's one. And then another one, which is quite interesting about the way forward and what's possible. This is from Carol Turner. She says, I agree with the way in which all speakers have situated the differences and mostly similarities between the Democrats and Republicans. It's certainly the case the anti-war and anti-nuclear movement must be on the street from day one. But she's most interested in how a party with mass appeal can be built that breaks with the consensus of the ruling party. So is there a possibility of that? And do you think support for the two left Democratic candidates represents a first stage of this? So is there a possibility for something new and different in US politics? So would any of you like to have a go at some of those? Phyllis, I see you indicating.
Yeah, just on the last one, you know, there's been efforts in the US over decades to create third parties. And at some point that will probably be something that is the way that the current stranglehold of the existing two parties takes shape. But I think what we may see before that, what we're already seeing, is what I mentioned earlier, just briefly, this notion of a split within the Democratic Party. We don't know how far it's going to go, but we do know that from 2016, where there was a great deal of tension between the two wings, focused on the election, focused on, you know, how the party leadership really suppressed the Bernie Sanders wing from having influence, suppressed his candidacy in the primaries, et cetera. It's really shifted away from that to movements that are putting enough pressure on so that by 2018, you had the election of a number of people. You've probably all heard about the what's known as the Squad, which is 4 particular young women of color that were elected to Congress in 2018. But there are several others. The leadership of the Progressive Caucus has become far more willing to take on and challenge the Democratic Party leadership. So there's now a much clearer political divide that isn't just about who's getting support from the Democratic National Committee or something. It's about what are the politics represented in the party. So I think that is now growing. We're seeing in this election, this time around, there's a number of people that look like they will probably be elected. There's an African-American man in, I'm blurring who is who, in New York, another in Kentucky. There's, no, it's not Kentucky. I won't try and go through them all, but there's about a half a dozen, mainly young, mostly women, not all, people of color that are very progressive, most of whom come out of movements. Some of them have been affiliated with the Democratic Socialists of America. Others have come out of the climate justice movement. Some have come out of the immigrant rights movement. And they reflect that set of politics. So we don't have in the United States anything that even pretends to be a, quote, labor party, a working people's party. The Green Party has over the years at various points had some presence, but the reality is, in my view, they've never had the kind of base at the grassroots level. They've never built the kind of national presence at the bottom before coming on to presidential politics. So they've never had they've never been a serious challenge to the two-party system. So, you know, I think these things are underway, but I think far more important in the short and medium term than when will we see a serious new third party is what's going to happen to the Democratic Party at a time when, despite the continuing reality of things like the Supreme Court case known as Citizens United that allows massive corporate and banking money to flood the campaigns, that has not yet been overturned, and it will take time before it does. But despite that, you have the recognition of people being elected that their election now depends not only on their big money, but on being able to convince people with that money, because after all, that's what keeps them in their jobs, is using that money for advertising and whatever. They're not going to be able to depend on getting, quote, Democratic Party votes when the Democratic Party is split. And they know they're going to have to take far more seriously than ever before, at least in the last, say, 60 years, the progressive wing of the party.
Okay.
And the progressive wing of the party is not the same as our movements, nor should it be at this stage, in my view. I mean, there's a different role that they play in Congress, but we do have now people in Congress who represent the broad view opposing the war on terror, opposing the new Cold War in China, that have not had this kind of influence until now. It's a very different political moment.
Sorry to try and cut you off there, because we've just got not got too much time. Vincent, yes, over to you.
Yeah. So the last part first is, or the first part, yes, I do think Trump is trying to steal the election. And we see that in a variety of ways, right? So there's the foreign influence, but aside from that, you're seeing things like we're seeing all sorts of things happening at our post offices with ballots. We're seeing where there are court cases right now ruling on if ballots can be counted after the election. He has said he won't agree to a peaceful transfer of power. And so what I really think his play is that come November 3rd, if there's enough mail-in ballots and we won't be able to have them all counted and declare an actual winner, he is going to say he's a winner no matter what. And if he wants any kind of recounts, he has stacked the court at 6-3. He will then kick it to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court gives him the election and he stays in power indefinitely. That's his play right now. So I do think, again, that's obviously a dangerous thing in terms of, and don't get it twisted. At the end of the day, what the Republican Party specifically and what the Trump Party, what they are trying to do is this is the next step in creating an apartheid rule. They want an apartheid minority rule in this country, and that's what they are going for. And so the other piece of this, we talked about Latin America, is I don't think that if you showed Trump a map right now and told him to find Bolivia on a map, he would be able to do so. I don't think he cares one way or another about Latin America. The one thing that it does affect, and where Biden could have a play, is if his policies, whether it's economic or military or in terms of diplomacy, whether it comes to Central America, because that can then affect immigration. That can affect how many people where I teach, I have one of the largest Salvadorian populations here. And so again, when you are talking about undocumented immigrants and what they are going through on a daily basis, that can matter. And the other piece is, while we are at a danger if Biden wins, as both other speakers have mentioned, kind of falling into a complacency as if the system will just be perfect now, and of course it won't, right? There is a realistic aspect of people are exhausted, right? Not us, the activists, the progressives, I'm talking about just the folks that are just exhausted. 90,000 cases of COVID a day we are averaging. Right? People from economics to their health to raising kids with schooling at the same time as working, they're exhausted. And so if Biden gets in there, that sense of normalcy, which we've all agreed normal in our system is not great, right, for the majority of people, but a sense of just for 5 seconds relaxing and feel that, okay, it's not Trump right now, that is somebody so completely unhinged, so xenophobic, so racist, so misogynistic, it will make a difference for some people's lives. So there is just that real aspect of it that, again, it doesn't mean that our system is going to be all that much better, especially in foreign policy, but that's the reality of it.
Okay, thanks very much, Vincent.
I want to add something.
Margaret,
sorry, I wanted to jump ahead a little. I think there's going to be far less, the drama is going to be in the counting of the votes. I think it's going to take a long time to declare the winner. With so many paper ballots this year, I think that is the great unknowable. I happen to think if Trump loses, he's out. I don't see the ruling class let him create too much chaos in the system. But there's always vote theft. That's how he became president in the first place. Democrats were cheated out of 2 presidential elections with the Electoral College, with voter suppression. There was direct voter suppression, which resulted in George W. Bush and Trump being elected, although the Democratic Party doesn't say very much about being cheated in the way the people were cheated. I'm not even going to say that they were cheated. I also wanted to say something about the allegations of foreign influence that have been pushed by the Democrats. So I am not confident that they are going to be better should Biden get in. I would love to talk about, Russiagate and the fraudulence of it, a fraud that was pushed by the Democratic Party in order partly to excuse themselves from their debacle and their loss, but also to make sure that US foreign policy did not change very much at all. So and I also want to say this about Biden. It's too late to try to push him to the left. Any demands should have been made during the campaign. He's telling us what he's going to do. They're bragging about which Republicans have endorsed him. This is not a left-leaning person. That is Biden's entire history is of being of the right wing of the Democratic Party. I don't see any hope of pushing. If people wanted to push, it should have happened sooner. And once he's in, I believe that two things are going to happen. There will be a collective sigh of relief. And I believe most people will fold their tents and go home.
Can I just add one piece?
Let me just ask, we've got 10 minutes. I'm going to put the last questions that we've got, and then I'm going to come back to each of you to make whatever remarks you wish to make. So if you wouldn't mind rolling it into that, Phyllis, sorry. Okay, I just want to get as many of these questions out there as possible. So I've got a couple that are around China. So Mike Martin says, can the panel give their assessment of Pompeo's recent visit to the Pacific region to stitch up an anti-China alliance, including Japan, India, Vietnam, and Indonesia? I've got another one in from Bradley Harrow, who says, what difference would Biden make in terms of tension with China? The containment of China is a long-run policy, not just from Trump. So that's a question around that. And then Jenny Clegg says, some US peace activists are arguing that Biden will give more voice to alternative views and could be pushed to the left. But should Biden win, would he be more likely to be pushed to the right? And if left voices get too strong in the Democrats, would the right wing react to exclude them, as we've just seen the move against Jeremy Corbyn? So that's a couple of interesting areas for you. And then please do roll in other elements that you want to, and treat this as your concluding remarks. If you've got any message for us, please do it at this time. So I'm going to take the speakers in the reverse order to the way they spoke originally. So Margaret, I'm coming to you first.
Well, in regard to China, I think we're going to see more of the same. What has Biden been saying? And I don't think we can act like, well, it's just for the campaign. I think we have to take these people at their word. And if Biden says that Xi is a thug, and they've had this stupid argument, Trump and Biden, about who's friendlier to China, who's going to be meaner to China. This is all an effort to try to put the genie back in the bottle and undo China's economic prowess. It's about to surpass the US and be the biggest economy in the world. And I see Biden will have smarter people. Pompeo isn't just evil, he's very stupid. I think Biden will have a smarter team of people. They will speak better. They won't be so crass as to utter the smears against China that Trump's people do. But the pivot to China started with Obama. This is going to be a prerogative of US foreign policy, no matter who is in the White House. And I think Americans, those of us who call ourselves progressives, have to really unpack this and be willing to fight against it, and not allow ourselves to be taken in by this talk of someone being our adversary. I don't allow them to use the first person with me. China's not my adversary. They tested 9 million people in 1 week in one Chinese city recently. So if people are concerned about COVID, they need to go and ask China for help for our country, which is now the crap hole country. But anyway. Okay,
thanks very much indeed, Margaret. That's fantastic. Vincent, over to you.
Yes, we only got about 5 more minutes, so I'll make this brief. As somebody that, as a scholar and as an activist, has pretty much dedicated my whole life to defeating institutional racism and nuclear weapons, and then having Trump and Putin, in my opinion, two white supremacist authoritarian leaders with 90% of the world's nuclear arsenal, and having a white supremacist my president right now, it can be incredibly defeating. But I made a promise long ago to all the atomic bomb survivors I've known over the years. I made promises to students for over the decades that I've taught. I owe it to my niece, who is biracial, and so many others that I don't know to keep fighting. So all I would say here is, regardless of the outcome, everybody on this call has a set of gifts. I can't draw a stick figure to save my life. I can't play a musical instrument. I have no artistic ability at all. All I have is my ability to write, my voice. So I would ask you on this call to use whatever gifts you have to make the world a better place, to fight all this injustice. And if when you go to bed at night, you can say you did everything you could, and that's all you can do. And my hope is just when I'm no longer here, there's a little bit less nuclear weapons, there's a little bit less racism in this world, and then we fight on. So again, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to be in here today.
Thanks very much indeed, Vincent. That's very moving, and you couldn't be more right about what's needed. So thank you very much indeed. And then Phyllis, over to you for your final thoughts.
Yeah, there's a lot. I think it's important. I don't hold Margaret's pessimism about our movements folding up our tents after, if Biden should be elected. I think people have learned lessons. I think some people did do that after Obama was elected. Not everybody did. And those that didn't set the terms for the movements that have grown since then. I also think there's one thing about Trump that is important, and I don't think other people necessarily all agree with this, but it's my view that one of the issues with Trump is that he's not accountable to any identifiable wing of the ruling class. He's identifiably connected and committed to his own wealth and that of his family. So I certainly agree that he doesn't really care about foreign policy, except to the degree that it makes his own businesses wealthier. But I think that has an impact on what is possible more long-term. I think that Margaret's point is very key about demands should have been made earlier, but I would point out that they have been consistently through this campaign. I'll give just one example. The Poor People's Campaign, which for those of you in the UK is an enormous, primarily faith-based, multiracial organization and movement of poor people across the country, that representing the 140 million people in the US who live either at the poverty line or just one paycheck above the poverty line, who in a presidential forum that they held, where all of the Democratic candidates felt it necessary to show up, or at least provide written answers later for the two that didn't show up, every one of them was asked, do you support cutting the military budget? And the answer of every one of them was yes. That doesn't mean they're going to do it. But I agree with Margaret, we do have to take them at their word and hold them to it. It's a tool in our hands when, whether it was Biden or any of the others, says, I will cut the military budget. We don't start with, will you cut the military budget? The next question is, by how much? And where will the money go? So we've been calling for a cut of $350 billion. And where will that money go? To a Green New Deal, to Medicare for all, to all these things. But I will end with the point about movements, because I think that's the most important. We have not only our legacy movements, our movements against war, against militarism, against nuclear weapons, but we have new anti-war movements that have risen. The Justice is Global, the dissenters of young people, mostly people of color, not all, but that are reaching out, that are far more intersectional, that are starting from the vantage point of the linkages between racism, militarism, climate, all of these questions and how they are linked, inequality at the core of it. And that's what gives me hope, that whoever gets elected in this thing, the difference will be in how movements are placed and how we do our work, not whether we continue to do our work. That will go forward. And that's where we have to depend on building internationalism into all of our movements, working with all of you in the UK and the rest of the world, so that it challenges this notion of the US being the empire of the world and turns into people in the United States being part of a global movement against war, against racism, for the climate, for the people. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Phyllis. And as I hope all our viewers know, CND is absolutely on side with your approach to that. And we've really been working to raise the question of militarism and climate change. And we've been in solidarity with Black Lives Matter movements here and globally. So these are very important. And I think fundamental for us is the idea that fighting against nuclear weapons isn't just some kind of silo over there. It's something that is absolutely fundamental and central to the whole structure of global power and global oppression and so on. So I thank you all very much for your incredibly interesting and informative talks today. I'd like to invite all our speakers. I know you're going to be incredibly busy after the election, but if you have time to put your thoughts down into an email for me, then we can share those with our viewers and share them on our website. So any kind of post-election analysis and so on that you have, we would be very, very grateful for it. So thank you for joining us today. Thanks to all our audience for joining, and for those of you who've asked questions and so on. And if anyone wants to just stay on the call briefly, you'll have a chance to look at CND's virtual stall. We can't sell our merchandise in the normal way, but you'll be able to see some of our offers. So if you want to get some Christmas presents lined up, this is for you. So thanks very much again to Phyllis, to Margaret, to Vincent, and to all of you for joining us today. And I hope to see you again at another webinar soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You have to say goodbye by saying peace. Peace out.
You all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.